afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webcast by the Miriam Institute, whether you're doing so via Zoom or the majority of you who are on Facebook Live, Twitter, and so on and so forth. We welcome you and we thank your sustained interest in the topic of the State of Israel, particularly given the fact that today we will be addressing ourselves most directly to the economic situation in that particular state. And we'll also be doing so through the lens not only of the economy, but also the social challenges that are coming to the fore and also the political challenges that are coming to the fore. And today's webinar is a continuation of a conversation that took place between our two interlocutors, Pinchas Landau and Allan Marks. I'll be reading you their bios in short order, but before I do, I just want to thank you again, and in the name of Rosita Panini, our co-founder and COO, and also our great and powerful colleague, Allan Langer. Welcome to the webinar. Now, just prior to telling you and refreshing your memories about our speakers, I want to try and make this as interactive as possible. So, Allan Langer, could you please tell everybody how they can ask a question in written form during the course of this webinar?
Absolutely. So there's an option, if you're on your computer or your phone, there's an option on your bottom control panel that says Q&A. All you have to do is click on that, write in your question, submit it, and it will go into the queue to be answered by our participants.
Thank you very much indeed. We look forward to anyone's questions that may be forthcoming, or you can email them via the form that was sent out in advance of this conversation. So, in terms of our discussants today, we have the pleasure of hosting Allan Marks. He is a partner at Milbank LLP and one of the world's leading project finance lawyers with special expertise in the power, including renewable energy, transportation, telecommunications, water, oil and gas, airports, rail and ports sectors. So very relevant to today's conversation. Allan also serves as an adjunct lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley, where he teaches at both the law school and the Haas School of Business. He advises developers, investors, lenders, and underwriters around the world in the development and financing of complex infrastructure projects, as well as related acquisitions, restructurings, and capital markets. And we thank you very much for being with us, Allan, and anybody who visits the Miriam Institute website can see some of Allan's writings and also listen to previous podcasts featuring Allan and led by Allan, including a wonderful conversation that he had with the then Surgeon General of the Israel Defense Forces and current Surgeon General of the Israel Defense Forces, Brigadier General Dr. Tarif Bada, when he just came into his current position. Obviously a very relevant role given the climate in the State of Israel today. And in addition, we have Pinchas Landau. Pinchas Landau is an economic and financial analyst serving as a consultant to major financial institutions in Israel and abroad on domestic and global developments. After working in banking and investment, he moved to journalism in 1983 and served as financial correspondent of the Jerusalem Post and then as senior columnist for Globe's Israel's Business Daily. He's written for many international newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal and Barron's, as well as numerous professional publications. Since 1996, Pinchas has been writing and publishing the Landau Report, a unique newsletter service which analyzes economic, business, and financial trends in Israel, as well as tracking Israeli and regional geopolitical affairs, and has attracted a global subscriber base. He's also been providing quarterly and annual reports on Israel for the Economist Intelligence Unit for 25 years. He's an accomplished speaker, lecturer in English and Hebrew to audiences in Israel and overseas on a range of issues relating to Israel and the Jewish world. He was born in London, educated at the London School of Economics, and he and his family have been living in Jerusalem since 1976. With all of that having been said, I'm going to step back from this conversation and hand all of you over to a discussion between Allan Marks and Pinchas Landau. We will run it for about 1 hour from now, inclusive of audience questions, and I look forward to reconnecting towards the end of this call. Thank you very much. Allan, Pinchas, it's over to you two.
Benjamin, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Pinchas, good evening to you. Good morning from me.
Hi.
Thanks again for coming back. You know, when we ended our podcast, our audio podcast back in March, I mentioned we should check back again when everything is all cleared up and done in 3 months. And of course, we're still in the midst of a global pandemic, and Israel no less than that, now I guess ranking number 6 in the world for per capita new cases after having successfully beaten it back during a lockdown a couple of months ago. So what I'd like to do is to kind of jump right into the economy, but we won't stay there only. We'll look at kind of the broader social political context as well. But first, kind of a snapshot of where we were then and where we are now.
You know, time is now so intense that periods of 3 or 4 months, which normally in an economy are very short-term developments, become long periods of time, and it's difficult to recollect where we were in March, April, when we were very much in the throes of the first wave, as it turned out. Had we spoken in May, say, then everything would have seemed very positive, oriented, and things were moving along very nicely. And even May has faded into a very ancient history, excuse me. We are now from a socio-political point of view, we are now in a very, very different situation in which, for reasons which we may discuss, but the bottom line is that the health situation was mishandled, and we have a very powerful second wave, which in terms of the number of people, number of infections is considerably larger than the first wave was. And the government and the country have been struggling with handling it from an economic point of view. One of the main efforts has been to avoid another national lockdown of the sort that we had in April, which of course had tremendous economic impact, negative impact across the board. And I'm going to kind of jump ahead and jump to the interim bottom line and say that despite everything that is happening politically, socially, fiscally, as we may come to later, and despite the many very serious problems in specific areas, the economy is holding up. And is nowhere near in as bad a state as you would have thought from seeing the data on illness and hospitalizations and so on. So in those very general terms, where we are is not where we want it to be. And where we're going is a very open question. But we will keep circling around throughout this conversation, coming back to this bottom line that key sectors of the economy are robust and holding in there.
Yeah, and let's unpack that for a second, because I think, you know, I take your point that on a macro level, the economy is still robust, but there are very obviously wide-ranging results in different sectors. And, you know, coming into this, Israel was on a very firm footing, positive balance of payments for years, low unemployment between 3% and 4%, relatively low government debt, 60% or so as a share of GDP. And now, in the course of, you know, the end of July, with the pandemic coming back, and society still with political, I'm going to call it dysfunction about how to shut down, whether to shut down, how long to shut down, what should be restricted, and kind of confusing messages about that. You know, we're at a point where we have almost 500 deaths from COVID-19 in Israel, and the situation for the economy is quite uneven. So I wonder if you could distinguish for a second between the impact on the services sector, which is about 70% of GDP, versus, say, manufacturing, or other parts of the economy. And then within services, the difference between how the domestic economy services like retail and hospitality and so forth have been much more impacted than high-tech services, much which are export-oriented.
Yeah, okay. You have identified many critical points, even at the level of headlines and questions. So, yeah, let's start with what is ultimately, for a small open economy, which is what the Israeli economy is, the most important economic factor is the balance of payments. Now, for non-economists, this is not obvious. And if you talk to people and you don't talk about employment and unemployment, for example, then they think that you're missing the point. But from a purely economic or macroeconomic point of view, the balance payment is more important. And as you mentioned, the balance payment has been positive. What I call Israel has swung at the turn of the century, for reasons we certainly don't need to go into now. Israel swung from over 50 years of chronic deficit in the balance of payments to a situation in the last 17 or 18 years of what I call chronic surplus. And this basic situation, first of all, has changed the face of the Israeli economy. It has moved Israel from being a net borrower, needing to finance itself every year, every quarter, all the time. How are we going to pay for our imports, which are greater than our exports? From that position, we have swung to being a net creditor, where we run a surplus and we invest money overseas in whatever. We have excess funds, like a household, and we have to find out what to do with it, as it were. So this is an incredible change in the Israeli economy, which lies behind much of what has happened in the last 20 years. This has not changed in any way as a result of the corona crisis. I would argue that the balance of payments surplus is not only remains entrenched, but is going to, it will likely grow. It will more likely grow than shrink. And I'll give you one extreme example of this. You talked about services, and we will talk at length about that. So within services, exports of services, there is tourism and things that go with tourism, such as airlines and transportation and so on. And in the tourist sector, anybody who knows anything about the Israeli economy knows that Israelis love to travel overseas. And on the other hand, Israel, as almost every country in the world, has in recent years been enjoying a boom in incoming tourism. So that in 2019, there were over 4 million incoming tourists, which is a number that 10 and certainly 20 years ago was totally inconceivable. Nevertheless, 9 million Israelis succeed in spending more money across the world than 7 billion other human beings manage to spend in Israel. So that means that in the tourist sector alone, Israel has a deficit, right? Because of the tremendous efforts of the Israeli public to go overseas and spend money. Now, put yourself in a situation which I used to imagine as a theoretical situation, in which there is no tourism, nobody comes in and nobody goes out, right? So if no Israelis spend money overseas and no foreigners spend money in Israel, then the previous minus is replaced by zero. So in a purely accounting sense, the elimination of foreign travel is actually a positive to the balance of payments. Now, that doesn't mean in any sense that it is a positive to the economy, because in tourism, it's not just how much you spend, it's the jobs and the ancillary things all around and the whole economic structure that goes with it. So we have had basically zero people leaving and people coming in since April. Nevertheless, so first of all, that sector, tourism, has been hammered and shattered. But it is now summertime. And again, the threatened closed lockdowns have been avoided. So Israelis chomping at the bit, tremendously desirous of going overseas, are unable to do so. Having no other choice, they have to go on vacation in Israel. And as of this moment, I mean, of course, if you want to stay at home with your kids the whole of August, you're welcome to do that. Funnily enough, most people don't want to do that. So if you want to get a room of any sort in a semi-decent hotel or in a youth hostel or in a camping ground anywhere in August, basically you can forget about it. It's all totally booked up. So again, right at this very kind of a granular level, things are adjusting, being forced to adjust. Now, within the tourist sector, you have the guides and the taxi drivers and all kinds of things around that. Plus, of course, the restaurants, the story in their own right, who have been gutted. So even within the tourist sector, it's much more complicated than it seemed in April. In April, it has been wiped out. In June, it was beginning to show signs of life. And in August, it's going to be thriving unless there's more trouble on the Lebanese border. But let's hope that things will quieten down. In August, it's going to be thriving, but it's still nowhere near the same as if this was as usual and it was foreigners coming in and we were going abroad. Right? So that's one section of the economy which happens to be a major employer in which there's very significant unemployment. Right? So we're beginning to move forward, right? We're distinguishing between effects on the balance of payments, effects on employment, effects on, say, tax collection, right? It becomes much more complicated.
Before we move into unemployment, because I would like to spend a fair bit of time there, let me though stay with the balance of payments for a second, and also see if you can comment on trade. I know I looked at the trade numbers for June, where imports were significantly down, whereas exports really weren't much at all. I mean, less than 2%. Does the strong shekel pose the risk here for Israeli exporters, or is the strong shekel on the whole better for the economy?
Okay, so first of all, apropos trade, right? You looked at the trade figures. The trade figures you looked at are trading goods.
Right.
Right? Trading goods where Israel has a permanent deficit. Okay, brackets. By the end of the 2020s, that will be a very different story because of something called energy and gas, which we need to talk about, but not if we're focused on 2020. If we're focused on 2030, it's an entirely different story. In 2020, as in 1918, 17, 16, and so on, a very significant trade deficit. In fact, the trade deficit grew very much over the last 5 years. Nevertheless, as I said earlier, the balance of payments as a whole, which includes trade in goods, but also includes trade in services and other elements, but the balance of payments overall is chronically positive. It's in surplus. There's nothing we can do about that. Now, jump a minute to your other point. Because the balance of payments is in surplus, a state of affairs unknown in America in the last 50 years, we have a currency which is, other things being equal, the currency is going to go up in value. And for the last 12 years, the Bank of Israel has been struggling against this underlying trend and trying to restrain the Israeli shekel from going up too much. And this is going to be an ongoing problem, and this again feeds into other areas such as the impact of energy. Will Israel succumb to the Dutch disease, which means that because of an inflow of a windfall, as it were, in the energy sector, you get a lot of money in, and your currency becomes overvalued. That is a genuine threat, but it's an issue for the medium and long term. Like many other medium and long-term issues, nobody's relating to it in the context of 2020 when everybody's focused on the immediate crisis. So, in the area of trade, where we have a permanent deficit, you absolutely correctly identify the fact that imports have gone down. Exports have also gone down. World trade has gone down. That is part of the global crisis. World trade has shrunk dramatically. And therefore, inevitably, all forms of trade are hit. Nevertheless, in the Israeli context, imports have gone down significantly more than exports. Therefore, the trade deficit has shrunk. Okay, now let's flip over to services, where tomorrow, I think, or the day after, we will get more data on services in May. Because for technical reasons, you looked at data for June, which is published in mid-July, and it's amongst the most rapidly published data for goods. Services runs much slower. We will see in May that, again, tourism is in very bad shape, and some other tourist-related, travel-related services, all bad news. But the driving force behind this tremendous change in the Israeli economy is service, basically high-tech service. Now, high-tech services includes many things, but it's R&D. It's all these companies, overwhelmingly American companies, and multinationals that come to Israel and set up R&D centers where they hire Israelis and pay them very good salaries. This, in national accounting terms, is the sale of services. The other element, or another element in this thing, is the sale of other services. For instance, I mean, it's much easier to translate things into concrete things. Most of our listeners, I would think, have heard of Amdocs. Amdocs is an Israeli software company which generates several $billion a year. Its product is billing services. It's probably the biggest, so to speak, manufacturer and seller of billing software for telecom companies in the world, right? So that Verizon and others use it, right? So Amdocs sells billions of dollars worth of software. So we have this tremendous engine, which is called software services. This engine is largely unaffected by COVID, by the coronavirus, because the guys have gone home, they have left the offices, they work from home, they generate pretty much the same amount of stuff. You don't even need ships to take it, it's all done electronically, and therefore the wheels are turned. Okay, so we add it together, you have trading goods net positive because imports have gone down more than exports. Why have imports gone down more than exports? For example, those oil prices have come down very dramatically. Other commodity prices have come down dramatically. Israelis, for the first year in 5 or 6 years, have stopped buying cars as if there was no tomorrow, right? So the purchase of new vehicles has fallen dramatically. So key areas of imports have dropped dramatically. Exports have also been hit, but not to the same degree, and therefore the goods deficit has shrunk. The services surplus has not shrunk, and therefore the balance of payments is continuing ahead. And you already identify which sectors in the economy are relatively unaffected and which are very seriously affected. And you then translate that into unemployment. And you begin
I want to go into unemployment actually more deeply, because so we're flying along at 30,000 feet. We're looking down on the macroeconomy, balance of payments and interest rates and currencies and strong export services and things look fine. And as we're coming down through the clouds and we're about to land, we notice that on the streets, there's significant pain being felt. I want to look at unemployment statistics too for a moment, because in Israel, we have these numbers which don't sound that bad. If you look at the Central Bureau of Statistics, where unemployment goes up, from 3.5% to 10%, maybe 10.7, and then it drops back down to the mid 5s. But if you look at the National Insurance Institute, or even more importantly, the Israel Employment Service, we're seeing jobless numbers on a more broadly measured, and in probably more of a real-time measurement as well, that peaked around 28% during the height of the shutdown, and even now are still over 20% by all reports, and may get worse again given the response that's going to be necessary to the public health situation. So in Israel, there are a lot of people who are either dependent depending on government assistance in the lieu of having a paycheck, and there's uncertainty about what shape that will take for a longer period of time than I think people probably expected when we talked 3 months ago. What does that mean for the economy and also for politics?
Okay, so now I'm going to say, another of these things which is terribly counterintuitive and quite kind of cruel, as it were, but it's nevertheless true. If you can imagine a business, right? Pretend that Israel is Israel Inc., right? And it does all kinds of things. And you come in as the CEO and you decide, well, this area of activity is not very effective, it's not generating a lot of bottom line. It employs a lot of people, it doesn't generate much profit, and we're just going to leave that area. Okay, now this is an everyday thing in the corporate sector. And it's the kind of decision that the board of a company would take. Well, this sector's not doing well, we're going to move away from that and go to concentrate on things that are profitable. Now think in terms of national economy, where these decisions are never taken for political reasons, right? And now there is a force majeure, this exogenous event on the biggest scale possible of a global pandemic. And the pandemic says these sectors of the economy are dysfunctional. And they contain 20% of the workforce. But they are not generating a lot of money. They are not even generating a lot of income tax, because these are generally, most of the people in those sectors are low income employees. And therefore the loss to the treasury, to the revenue, is not 20%, maybe 5%. Okay? That is what is happening. Right? It's not something that anybody can talk about in public because it's so unpleasant. But these are the simple facts, right?
Let me just challenge one piece of that analogy, because if I'm a corporate CEO and I'm making investment decisions, I'm really responsible to my shareholders, perhaps my employees, perhaps my customers. There are stakeholders, but I'm not responsible for everybody, and I'm not responsible for even an entire sector. Whereas the government is responsible for.
That's absolutely right. That indeed is right. But I'm looking at it from the point of view of the economy, where these decisions have not been made consciously, but have been imposed from the outside. What is the result? Okay, so the result is that you have a large number of people who have been fired, right? Who have been laid off, whether it's totally or partially, officially or otherwise. And as I said, this is not affecting, if the bottom line of the economy from an economist's point of view is the balance of payments, as we discussed earlier, right? Your operations against the whole of the rest of the world, and you are turning a decent profit. So then it's unfortunate these people got laid off, because exactly as you say, as CEO of the corporation, you're not charged with running everybody's life. Now we switch back to the realities of a national situation where the government can say, oh, that's great, and on the financial sector there isn't an impact. But if 20% of people are unemployed, with tremendous implications, right? Young people have lost their jobs and are not able to pay the rent, and they're going home to live with their parents, and maybe even young couples as well, and huge social disruption, right? So then it's not something government can say, well, that's unfortunate or too bad. So therefore, governments everywhere have intervened. So I just want to make that point clear, that the unemployment is first and foremost a socio-political issue, and not first and foremost an economic issue.
There's actually a piece of good news implicit in what you're saying. And I know the title of our talk today is, will Israel survive this economically? I suspect perhaps the question is really how, in what shape will they survive it? Because if a government is fortunate enough, as the Israeli government is, to have strong macroeconomics, notwithstanding high unemployment, notwithstanding continued public health costs and challenges, that gives them, one would think then, the fiscal firepower to both provide assistance to ameliorate that harm and to borrow without at a very low interest rate for a very long time without really being penalized by capital markets. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And then we now come to a different kind of discussion, which is what should the government do? What is the government doing? And so on, right? We're now in a different discussion, which is to do with government policy, which by definition is reactive because of this tremendous event, global event, which is imposed on all governments, right? So the government has to react across many fronts. Now, let's talk about unemployment, right? In other words, the government very wisely has not told companies what to do and how to do it and so on, beyond the kind of technical things of which are very major, how many people you can have in the room and how they should be spaced out and so on. But again, the economy has adjusted between those who can work from home, come in part-time and so on, and entire sectors which can't function under these circumstances. Now, this is germane to America, it's germane to every developed Western economy. The economy can function perfectly well if all restaurants close down tomorrow. That does not affect the economy. It is a lifestyle thing. I want to go to a restaurant. I want to go out with a girl. I want to take her to a restaurant. My wife it's her birthday. Restaurants are not essential to the economy. They are a major source of employment, and they therefore they're part of GDP, right? But even within GDP, you have this cruel fact that there's things that are essential, things that are not essential. However, if all the people in the restaurants are laid off, then they are unhappy, and they don't spend, and all the other effects trickle down. Now, again, you look at the areas that have been hit, and the people who have been rendered unemployed again, partially or wholly. This is not an across-the-board thing that X% of all employees have lost their jobs. This is not the situation at all. The economic crash, and let's face it, it's a depression, certainly at the level of the statistics, right? But are very much unlike the 1930s. It is tremendously focused on certain areas. Okay, so those areas are not down 20%, they're down 80 or 90 or 95. Now, it happens, and again, whether the facts are that the people who are being laid off in, certainly in the restaurant sector, in the whole of the entertainment sector, from orchestras down to bars and karaoke dances, all of these people are skewed in the direction of young, right? So in other words, when we talk about unemployment, it is not spread across population. It is very much younger people, low-paid people, low-income people, unskilled people, right? You have very clear characteristics. Now, come back to the government. The government's any government has to say, okay, what are we going to do about this? And so, as you very rightly said, even in countries which are not in a good financial situation, the government has said we must step forward. Now, in Israel, where the financial situation was very strong and they had considerable degrees of freedom in how they went about it, they initially said, okay, we're going to spend 100 billion shekels. 80 billion went up to 100 billion, which is in terms of GDP, which is what matters, it's significant, but it was not yet at the European level. This was in the first round. So now we see another interesting thing, that in the first wave, which was very bad medically and terrible from an economic point of view, the government did not spend anywhere near as much money as it had said it was going to spend. For bureaucratic reasons, for organization, for many reasons. Fact is, again, if you're a bean counter, the money didn't go out. Now, then things began to get better, and as you said, the unemployment rate began to go down quite rapidly, but not rapidly enough, but we were clearly moving in the right direction. Then things ground to a halt and began to turn around. Now it's clear that things have turned around. A lot of people are again losing their jobs. Nowhere near as bad as it was then, but the situation is not good. The government says, okay, we hear what you said, and you actually said this wonderfully well. It is not good enough just to give a stopgap for a few weeks or a few months. We are going to produce a program which gives people a sense of confidence through till mid-2021, for a whole year, so that both people and employees and self-employed and businesses can feel that there is, we know where we are tomorrow, next week, next month, and hopefully by middle of next year, things will be very different. And they put together a program eventually, let's skip the things along the way, put together a program and announced it. Now, this program has been severely criticized by the most economists, as well as many politicians, and most economists, for the simple reason that it makes the mistake of paying people too much directly. One of the problems in Israel in April, May was the money was not getting through. Either with wrong people, it wasn't getting to the right people, or it wasn't getting through at all for technical and bureaucratic reasons. This time it said there's going to be more than enough money and it's going to go straight to you. The result is today that many companies are trying to attract employees, either to expand the workforce, to restore their work. There is demand for labor, and the supply is not showing up because the government has so structured things that it is, for many people, not worthwhile working. They will be better off remaining at home doing nothing and receiving government money than going to a job. Okay, so that's a major distortion. And this is an example of a very serious policy mistake.
Let me ask a question, though, about that distortion, because just in connecting some dots, if people who are most vulnerable, who are lower income, which by definition is why their high unemployment does not really move the needle on GDP, right? And they're the most vulnerable. Does that say something more structurally about the economy and the imbalance either in wages or an allocation of national income? And this is merely a reflection of that problem, and maybe it perpetuates it. Is there something else going on there? Because obviously the Israeli economy today is very different than it was 30 years ago, and I suspect in 20 or 30 years it will be different again, positively or negatively for some. How do you view that changing? Is there a political demand to address cost of living and disparities in income, or is that something which is just exposed now because of the vulnerability of the national crisis with public health, but will eventually go back down politically and economically?
Absolutely, again, you're right in that there is an interplay of underlying long-term issues, some of which have been forced to the fore, and short-term issues of, so there are two massive structural issues facing the economy on a long-term basis. Now, just to illustrate this, I want to go back 20 years, okay? So it's now 2020. In 21 years. In 1999, there was an election which Netanyahu lost and Ehud Barak won. And let me kind of cut to the quick. I, with a colleague, we wrote a paper which we gave to Barak's people, focusing on what was then, for almost all economists, an inevitable disaster. The economy was heading for disaster because the participation rate, the number of people in the economy was impossibly low. Welfare payments were very high, and this imbalance was going to weigh down the budget and ultimately weigh down the economy, so that if you simply extrapolated out 10 or 20 years, it was obvious the economy would collapse and the country would go with it, right? This is the kind of thing the economists do. They just say, well, look, if this carries on for 10 or 15 years, then So it wasn't difficult and it wasn't original, right? This was clear. And the problem was that you had a large number of people, and especially you had two major population groups who were not involved in the economy, and therefore the national participation rate was low. I mean, low even by American standards, let alone by Western European standards. Right? These two population groups were the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, and Israeli Arabs, each for different reasons, but the fact is that their involvement in the economy was very low, and their rate of increase was very high at that time, at its highest ever, relatively. And you fast forward 15 or 20 years, and this apocalyptic scenario did not happen. On the contrary, okay, so what did happen? So very briefly, there was a massive crisis at the beginning of the century brought on by the tech wreck and the Intifada, which ripped apart the domestic economy and a global thing and so on. And then a guy called Netanyahu came in, was appointed much against his wishes by Ariel Sharon as finance minister. And within a very short space of time, a slew of major socio-economic reforms were put into place, which included pension and tax and really very important things. And the welfare system was turned inside out and cut back and so on. And these supposedly immutable trends changed. And then for 10 or 15 years, you saw a different state of affairs. First of all, the overall labor force grew. The participation rate grew. Haredim began to come into the labor force more and more. And in the last decade, Arab women also began to come into the labor force more and more. Okay, so here you see an interplay of how policy creates one state of affairs, how you can turn it around to create another state. Now we're in January 2020. Nobody has yet heard of COVID. The positive effects of those trends have kind of faded out. The participation rate has stopped rising and so on. There is a massive need going forward to encourage people to come into the labor force, but that's no longer the biggest problem. We're not dealing with simple numbers, with a quantitative problem, we're dealing with a qualitative problem. That the people who are coming into the labor force, the Haredi young men and the Arab men and women, have too little education, too few skills, and are not suitable for the 21st century economy. And therefore, we need investment in education and training and so on and so on. This was the big long-term issue facing the economy last year and the year before, and as recently as 6 months ago. This is still...
So if you look at that, and you look at what the government is doing, when we talked in March, there wasn't yet a government. There wasn't, therefore, yet the possibility of a budget. And now we have this looming deadline in August 25th, under the coalition agreement, although other things may happen before that, where a budget needs to be in place for at least the next year or two, which is what's required. And in order to invest in infrastructure, to invest in education, to invest in public health, and set some long-term intervention, that budget has to be passed. And that, of course, brings us back, unfortunately, again, to politics. Economically, would that scale of investment be feasible? And do you think it's likely? And you said it's necessary, which I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to say something that, again, is totally counterintuitive, and it is not only necessary, it is essential. It is sine qua non. There is no survival for the Israeli economy, so the Israeli socio-economy, if these groups are not integrated. Fortunately, and this is a long discussion in its own right, fortunately, over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a massive change in these societies, an intergenerational shift, and these people as a generality want to be integrated. If they didn't want to be, then it wouldn't matter what laws you passed and what structures you created. Without it being grassroots, it wouldn't happen. So this is happening, and this is essential for the economy to survive and grow in the long term. So that kind of investment is not optional. It is essential. Now you can say, okay, this year we've got a crisis and we can't afford to do those things, but come next year or the year after, you're going to have to catch up. By the way, exactly the same is true in the area of physical infrastructure. If the problem of traffic congestion in the greater Tel Aviv area is not resolved, then you can forget about the whole thing. People will not be able to move. And it's no good saying, well, everybody's going to work from home now. That's nice, but that's not going to run the whole economy. So,
and from an economy standpoint, what you're really saying is you can't have productivity growth unless you fix transportation.
Right. So from the point of view of your professional thing, you'll be pleased to know that this is a country that is going to spend an enormous amount of money in the 2020s on physical infrastructure. And just to cut to yet another issue, because of global geopolitics, and don't need to expand on this, the Chinese are not going to be invited to do this business. And therefore, if you happen to know any American companies which do infrastructure, then please tell them to get ready, because I talk to Japanese companies and others. This is going to happen big time. Okay, so what I'm saying in essence is that there are long-term challenges which you cannot even address, or you can't get out of them, you can't avoid them and say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, terribly important, but I haven't got money. That will not cut ice in the medium term. Right? You're going to have to address them. Now come back to this crisis, right? So the people, okay, it's true, the kids who used to wait on restaurants have lost their jobs, and that's very unfortunate. That is not again, as we discussed before, it's not a macroeconomic problem. But if people are losing their jobs and cannot get alternative jobs, that is a major problem. The biggest criticism of what we've seen coming out of this very, very dysfunctional government that we have been saddled with is that all of their talk in terms of what they're doing, even their actual programs, do not address these critical issues of retraining, of improving the quality of the labor force, of taking this opportunity, as it were. Okay, you've got all these people who have lost their jobs. Now spend a lot of money on giving them more and better skills. And this is the single biggest criticism of now. Then you have to ask, well, why is this? Why are these issues not being addressed? And so you're left with answers of short-termism, political expediency, and other things which are not polite to talk about, but which are very much front and center in Israeli life today. And this is feeding the snowball effect of demonstrations, which are moving up from day to day and from week to week.
So I want to ask another question before I invite Benjamin Anthony to come back with some questions I'm sure we're getting from the audience. But is there a risk if that investment?
Give me, Allan, just to bring this up to speed for you. Most of the questions centered around the tourism sector. So
Fine.
I'm actually going to let this run because you spent a great deal of time on that, although there's a lot more you can. So you can run this to the end of the conversation. I'll come in about 2 minutes before conclusion. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So I want to circle back this, obviously, and I would hope that there is significantly more public infrastructure investment, whether it's in transportation or telecommunications, certainly public education, public health, I think will be another area where we're going to see significant increased investment, not just in Israel, but globally. Quite often when there's been deferred or postponed investment in key infrastructure and a problem happens like a pandemic or a bridge collapsing or whatever it might be, then people remember, oh, gee, I guess we should, take care of that. And there's opportunities for it. But in education in particular, and helping people to get the skills that are needed to adapt. What we're talking about there is not just situational unemployment because of the pandemic or because of the lockdowns that are required to deal with the pandemic, but there you're looking at structural unemployment. People where when the economy, quote, comes back, they'll still be looking for something to do. And I know that's, again, not a uniquely Israeli problem, but I want to look at it in the Israeli context. How much of a risk is that the problem will not, in fact, be addressed adequately, and that there will be a number of people who are left out, despite the progress that was made up until, say, 6 months ago, for the past decade.
When you say risk, you really have to define the kind of risk you're talking about, because again,
I guess it's the risk. Okay, so I'll be specific. It's the risk that unemployment cannot come back down because you have employees or potential workers who don't have the skills necessary to take the jobs that will then exist, which is then also translated into a loss of productive capacity and a lack of employment capacity for the economy as a whole.
Okay, here we're getting into very deep waters because, as you pointed out, these are not specifically Israeli issues, these are global issues. Israel may have certain advantages and certain disadvantages relative to other developed economies, but it is certainly not heretical to suggest that we will never see in the foreseeable future 3 and 4% unemployment again. That was an aberration, and that going forward, the rate of unemployment will remain high because of some of the things we talked about, because of the failures of government policy, but also because not on the horizon, down the road, march the robots, right? And so therefore, the kids in Starbucks will not go back to Starbucks because they'll simply, Starbucks may survive, but it will, and I'm giving it as an example, right? The machines will do the job. So you're being challenged not just by providing low-income jobs, but you'll have to provide better jobs. In other words, more and better jobs. Now that, as you said, that we're now talking about a societal reset with major reforms in education, in the whole structure of the labor market, in welfare, and so on. Okay, and these require thought and a great deal of effort and money. And nobody has the answers. Just to make it more encouraging, nobody has got the formula that you can just have a manual how to. And in Israel's case, this is one of the areas where Israel is different from other countries. In certain Western European countries, and probably in the United States, it was and maybe it will be possible to live with a permanent underclass of people who are unemployed and basically left behind in squalor and so on. In Israel, that will not work. You will not be able to have 10 or 15% of the population in poverty, which they don't want, right? So the Haredim, for ideological reasons, have been prepared to live under conditions that most other people wouldn't live because that was their ideology. This won't work going forward. So there are tremendous social, political pressures building up. But again, the immediate issue facing Israel and the Israeli government is provide employment, or more particularly, I'd say provide sources of income immediately. And the government has chosen to go down the path of here, take money, which I regret to say, I call this Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a very problematic country with an elite and lots of very high rate of population growth, and when there is social unrest, the government says, here, take money, go home, shut up, leave us alone. Even in Saudi Arabia, it doesn't work in the long term. In Israel, it's certainly not going to work.
So let's turn the microscope around and let's take a broader view, if we can, because you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and I want to, in the time that we have, look at some of the geopolitical context, because Israel obviously is part of a larger economy. It's got free trade agreements and strong trading relations with the United States, with countries in Asia, with Europe for sure, and increasingly has ties to some of the Gulf states, as very, politically at least, and militarily strong relations at the moment with Egypt under Al-Sisi. The question with Turkey, which is kind of flexing its muscles in the region, as far afield as Libya, that's a question mark. And then, of course, there's the question looming over what to do with Gaza and the territories. How does that geopolitical dynamic affect the Israeli economy in the medium term?
These, by definition, almost the geopolitical dynamic can only affect the economy slowly and gradually, the medium to long term thing. Nevertheless, fortunately for us, as it were, we are talking days after an event, a massive, momentous event in the history of the Israeli economy, which you know how important it is because it completely passed by the mainstream media, which just noted its existence, but basically failed totally to grasp the significance of what happened. Okay, so last week, Chevron Corporation, which is a energy major based in California, bought Noble Energy, which is an energy miner based in Houston, Texas, for $5 billion. And that's really not a big deal in the global energy sector. It just so happens that Noble Energy is the company that found the two big gas fields offshore in Israel and a major gas field off Cyprus, and is the major player and operator in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Chevron, like all the American and European majors, has never, ever done anything with Israel because of geopolitical considerations, meaning to say the Arab boycott in its various forms. When Chevron bought Noble, Chevron became the biggest player in the Eastern Mediterranean, biggest player in Israeli energy, biggest player in Cyprus. It is a player in Egypt. And behind Chevron are ExxonMobil and the rest of the gang. This is huge. It is inconceivable that Chevron took this decision without running it past the sorties. Where, of course,
it's actually very interesting. I think there's some circumstantial evidence for what you're saying because, and fair disclosure, we've been involved in some of these transactions, so I don't want to say anything too specific. But in the public announcement when Chevron bought Noble, which fundamentally was necessary given how Noble's been hammered by the drop in oil prices in the United States and globally. But when Chevron bought it, they did not suggest that they're going to be divesting tomorrow Leviathan, Israeli assets. Leviathan, in fact, and the potential gas reserves that are under development and now in operation in Israel, and the supplies to Egypt and all the cash flow.
I want to argue much beyond
assets
that.
That they wanted to keep.
Okay, I would argue much beyond that. Noble is first and foremost an East Mediterranean company. It does have operations in Texas and it has operations in West Africa. But you wouldn't buy Noble if you didn't want the operation. No, you don't buy a company and shed the main part of the company and keep the minor part. That doesn't work that way. And so Chevron bought Noble knowing what Noble is and does, and it wasn't an opportunistic thing. Oh, well, look, it's very cheap, let's buy it. The implications of buying Noble are so huge. And as I say, they could not have done it without getting an okay from the Saudi Arabian government and at least a grudging look the other way from the Kuwait. Right? It's just impossible. Now let's go further. Okay, they are now, apart from Israel, they now own the big offshore field in Cyprus, which the Turks will not allow the Cypriots to develop. Now, if Chevron shows up outside Cyprus, the Turkish Navy is not going to treat Chevron the same way as it treated Noble. The implication of Noble becoming a major player in the Eastern Mediterranean is that the United States of America has resurfaced in the Eastern Mediterranean. Right? And the fact that this event occurred after work by the Israeli government and the Trump administration and the respective energy secretary and ministry and so on, this didn't just happen. It didn't just somebody phoned up and said to the CEO of Chevron, hey, I got a cheap oil company. You want to buy it? Right? It didn't happen that way. This is much, much bigger. Okay? So the Americans are back. The Turks are now facing problems. They cannot continue to boss Cyprus around and put their clamps on everything. The Greeks are champing at the bit to do this cross-Mediterranean thing. The Egyptians who are buying Israeli gas, nobody understands why. It's not worth it, okay, in the short term because of the price of natural gas. Incredible things are happening in East Mediterranean energy. And 4 or 5 years ago, it looked like the whole thing was dead after the previous price crash. And now it's coming back to life big time. And behind Chevron will come other majors, Europeans and Americans. So, I alluded to this earlier. Right? The energy sector is going to be major in terms of the Israeli economy. Not dramatic, but a significant, it's going to become significant. But the possibilities, what does this mean for the Middle East, which is fortunately far beyond the scope of our discussion? Hamas faces the question, are we going to continue to live in squalor and poverty, or will we allow somebody to develop our offshore gas? Lebanon is bankrupt. Hezbollah faces the same problem. Are we to continue as this two-headed creature of a Lebanese political party and an Iranian puppet in the Middle East? Or are we going to allow big companies to come in and develop Lebanon's offshore gas, which implicitly, even if nobody says anything, implicitly means there is a non-aggression pact with Israel? It's that big.
So Pinchas, they say the sign of a good discussion is that we always leave wanting more, and I know I do, because the geopolitics of all of this, the future of energy and what that might mean, not just for the economy, but for climate, for balance of payments, everything else. I think these are a lot of topics we could spend days on, but I know that if we do, Benjamin Anthony will stop me. So with that, I just want to thank you very, very much. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I very much appreciate talking to you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much to both of you, Allan and Pinchas, Allan Marks, Pinchas Landau. Thank you so much for, again, picking up the conversation on behalf of Rosita and me, and also Allan Langer, and everybody who's listening here on Facebook Live and Twitter and on Zoom and in the postcast. We very much appreciate the information that you've brought to light. And we look forward, as I say, to resuming this conversation further down the road. And Pinchas Landau, if ever I want to pick me up and just a shot of good feelings in the arm, I know exactly who to call. Thank you. Be well. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.